Well, good morning to all of you all. You know, it's often said that this could be a speaker who needs no introduction. That might have been an introduction and needs no speaker. Thank you, Pedro, for your comments. So really, it's very good to be here. It's an honor to be asked to help to jumpstart this very important institute conference. In a relatively small, compressed time period, what I like to do is to share with you some of the issues, some of the activities that my colleagues and I have been grappling with over the last several years. For us, it comes down to essentially how to more greatly ensure the academic success, indeed the life success of American students in general, and in particular those of certain students of color. My remarks today are intentionally meant to be provocative. And when I say provocative, I'm really talking about provoking your thinking, maybe stretching your thinking about issues that are relevant to the themes of this particular institute. I don't simply want to raise problems and identify issues that need attention. I also want to at least give some attempt at offering, what shall I say, candidates for some promising pathways to be pursued in the not too distant future. As was mentioned, over the last several years, a lot of my professional work has been focused on this beast that they call the achievement gap. But what I want to say at the outset is that although it's widely acknowledged that there are significant, persistent achievement gaps between, for example, Black and Latino students and their white counterparts. However, when we examine the documentation, the actual documentation for these achievement gaps, the obtained pattern we get really defies easy, straightforward, convenient explanations. Here's a case in point. This is recent data, 8th grade reading from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEPS, the so-called Nations Report Card. And these are average scores for 8th graders, but the data are broken down by race and parents' highest level of education. And what you see here, if you look at the graphic on the far left, you see that there is, for example, a 16-point gap between the performance of white and Black students whose parents did not finish high school. But now go over to the far right column. The gap doesn't shrink. The gap is almost twice as large. It's 28 points between white and Black students whose parents are college graduates. And then look at that score, that scale score for Black students whose parents are college graduates, 256. Look at the scale score for white students whose parents didn't even finish high school. It's the same. It's 256. And you get the same basic pattern that shows up between white and Latino students. In fact, you get 3 times the gap between Latino and Black and white students whose parents are college graduates than you get for white and Latino students whose parents didn't finish high school. So I think the point to be made here is that these data can't simply be explained away because so many Black or Latino kids are from poor, disadvantaged, low SES backgrounds, from under-resourced families. We need to find, shall we say, less convenient explanations. We believe that this kind of pattern of data implicates the quality of education that too often takes place inside schools, inside classrooms, not just in schools that serve Black students and low-income communities, but also those that serve Black and Latino students, even in more affluent communities. And then just to generalize a little bit, here's some data actually that just came out in May of this year. Here we go to 12th grade. These are math scores. Same kind of setup. You can see here that the gap between white and black students whose parents didn't finish high school, 16 points. The gap is twice as large between black and white students whose parents are college graduates. Again, we can't account for these data in easy and trying out the usual suspects of reasons for why gaps exist. And again, you see that the scores for black students whose parents are college graduates is the same essentially as that for white students whose parents didn't even finish high school. And look for Latinos. The gap is 20 times larger for them. Parents are college graduates than when they are not even high school graduates. So these kinds of data need to also be part of our backdrop as we decide and discern ways in which we want to address this nettlesome, this persistent notion of the achievement gap. But just for contrast, if you will, let's go down the age level a bit. Let's go to preschool. Here are also some relatively recent data. Preschool suspensions. Black children, for example, comprise 18% of preschool enrollment, but black kids comprise 42% of those kids suspended from preschool one time, and 50% of those who have multiple suspensions from preschool. And the majority of these suspended kids who are black are boys. You mean to tell me that there are very many black children that are being suspended from school even before they start kindergarten? What's up with this? This needs our attention. But the plot thickens. Yes, there is this gap between minority group and majority group students, well documented across a lot of different domains, but there are other gaps as well that need to capture our attention. There are gaps between American students broadly considered K to 12 compared to students K to 12 in other parts of the world, particularly in countries in Asia and in Europe. Our students come out middle of the road. There is this gap. And there's also a gap that we have noticed all too often as we go around the country working with schools and districts, that all too many of our schools essentially are still preparing students for the realities of the 20th century and not preparing them for the roles and responsibilities in the 21st century. So one thing that I think needs to be really taken away from this particular added complexity is that when we talk about closing the achievement gap, it's not simply about helping black and brown kids, for example, catch up with their white counterparts. There is room for improvement for all of our nation's children in general. So what we should be doing is looking at how we can raise achievement levels, raise attainment levels for all students, but doing it, if you will, simultaneously, more steeply for certain students of color. And what this says to us is that certainly there is an issue of equity we need to deal with, an issue of equity we need to deal with, but there's also an issue of excellence. And so what we should be looking for are strategies, interventions, programs, and the likes that follow the pattern up on the screen right now. Raise achievement for all students, but raising it more steeply for certain students of color. And in doing this, we will simultaneously address issues of equity and issues of excellence. Now, given certainly because my background as a research psychologist, it's important, I believe, that we do our work, examine these kind of nettlesome issues, if you will, by following what the evidence tells us, letting the evidence be our guide. And for the work that we've been involved in, we have three criteria, three litmus tests for what good evidence should look like. First of all, the evidence, we say, do we have confidence that the results we obtain are because of what we did and not for some other spurious kind of reason? Also, can we repeat this enterprise? And can we get basically the same kinds of findings again? And then thirdly, can other folks, not just us who are rooting for certain findings to come out, can others get the same results elsewhere in similar settings? Well, methodologists have three little fancy terms for these particular criteria. The first is internal validity, the second is reliability, and the third is external validity or generalizability. And so the point is that we believe to let evidence be our guide, to see what we can do to raise achievement for all students while raising it more steeply for kids of color. Now, certainly, there have been many solutions offered over the years. And in our sort of search of what others and even what we ourselves are attempting to do, the solutions boil down often to two categories. There are technocratic solutions, and there are what we call transactional solutions. Technocratic versus transactional solutions. When we talk about technocratic solutions, it turns out these are the ones we typically see that are being attempted, that are being implemented over the last several years, more often than not. Technocratic solutions have to do when decision makers basically want to know what to do to improve schools, improve achievement. They look to things that have to do with what? Changing institutional arrangements, per se, or policies or procedures having to do with the way schooling is organized or how it's structured or how it's regulated. You've heard these before. They're often on the pages in our papers across the country for the solutions that we need to pursue. They say we need to have longer school days or longer school years. We need to have a new textbook adoption. We need block scheduling. We need smaller class sizes. We need to set up yearly benchmarks for standardized test improvement and hold folks accountable, particularly if they don't reach these benchmarks. But what we would want to add to this discussion is that when you bring solid and systematic evidence to bear on what is more likely to close achievement gaps while raising achievement levels in general, we believe that evidence points toward including transactional solutions. And transactional solutions have to also be considered. And they essentially entail solutions having to do with optimizing learning exchanges occurring inside classrooms or other key learning settings that going on a daily basis between students and teachers and among students themselves. These interactions form the fundamental bases, if you will, of everyday teaching and learning. Let me just sort of talk about this with a few semi-hypothetical examples. So merely extending the class period from 50 minutes to 90 minutes by itself won't solve the achievement problem if teachers didn't know what to do with the 50 minutes they had in the first place. Extending the school day or the school year by itself won't solve the problems if the school day or the school year was already one of drudgery. It might even make things worse. And then reducing class size, for example, from 30 down to 15 students could be worse if those now 15 students are still in a toxic classroom. Almost 20 years ago, an iconic cognitive psychologist named Jerome Bruner made an observation that's a slightly different take on what we've offered here about transactional solutions, but I think makes the point quite well and quite succinctly. He said, and I quote him, "Of course we need standards and resources to make our schools work well in solving the myriad tasks that they face. But resources and standards alone will not work. We need a sure sense of what to teach, to whom, and how to go about teaching in such a way that it will make those taught more effective, less alienated, and better human beings." So in the pursuit of the work that we've done in recent years, we have been, shall I say, concocting a framework, not just us, others as well, a framework that can capture the kind of directions that we believe the evidence is taking us. And we sort of refer to this as a human capacity building framework. And there is mounting evidence that this framework has heuristic value, if you will, in the pursuit of equity and excellence. So how is this framework laid out? It makes the argument that it is in the best interests of our society at large to promote widespread high-level knowledge and skills and abilities in intellectual, technical, and civic participation domains, and for successive cohorts of our diverse American population. It also goes on to say that capacity building itself is predicated on the presumed reality of the integrity and the life experiences of people from diverse backgrounds. And integrity conveys the notion that in people's lived experiences and the consequences of these experiences, there is complexity, there's coherence, and there is depth. Therefore, for students from certain, shall we say, educationally marginalized backgrounds, we should not simply construe them in terms of pathologies and deficits and weaknesses, and in turn, base our improvement on fixing them because these students are broken. I want to take this just one step further. We'll call this an exercise in food for thought, if you will. I submit that to pursue this human capacity building approach in earnest would require us rejecting some of the sacred cows that implicitly, if not explicitly, we hold so dear in educational circles. Sacred cows whose existence we have all too often just taken for granted. And one of these sacred cows is the bell curve, the normal distribution. You know, all too many educators and others espouse the notion that all students can learn to high levels, but inside many folks' heads, they still embrace, even implicitly, the existence of the bell curve simply as a way of life. So the bell curve is making this point here that, you know, most people are going to wind up in terms of their ability somewhere in the middle of this distribution, this average level, and only a few will be out there on the far high end. Let me just talk about this a bit, to spend a whole lot more time, but just to give you again some food for thought. Let's just look at the historical backdrop for the origin of this so-called bell curve, or some called normal curve. This bell curve notion was first identified back in the 18th century. If you want to know what date, it was 1708 by a gentleman named Gauss. What he was trying to do was to basically identify the ways to represent the binomial distribution. The binomial distribution is when you flip a coin many times over the course of all these flips and you chart the number of heads, it's going to form this nice bell curve. This was the original intent. Purely mathematical, random events in terms of outcomes. Now, into the 19th century, those who were embracing an ideology known as social Darwinism took this notion out of its more purely mathematical domain and postulated that the bell curve described ways that things like intelligence, for example, are distributed in the natural world, and is led down to the 20th century into the present day as the basis for norm reference tests for school grading policies and the likes. But consider, if you will, I will read it out loud while you read to yourself, this observation made by Benjamin Bloom over 40 years ago. He said this normal curve, this bell curve, is not sacred. It describes the outcome of a random process. Since education is a more purposeful activity in which we seek to have students learn what we teach, the achievement distribution should be very different from the so-called normal curve if our instruction is to be effective. In fact, Bloom said, our educational efforts may be said to be what? Unsuccessful, to the extent that student achievement is normally distributed. And so just for food for thought, maybe from a human capacity building standpoint, we need to put the normal bell curve on the sideline and look at a different kind of distribution that I will call the J curve. Yes, there probably are folks who are intellectually challenged on the low end and will be there. And there are folks that genuinely, you might want to call geniuses. But this notion at least suggests that the majority of our population has the general ability or capacity to function at the high end. Again, replacing the bell curve with the J curve. Just call it, for now, food for thought. So, where does this lead us? This is a scheme that we have been working with, and it's still a work in progress, if you will, but a scheme that is backed up by the best research we know about for promoting enhanced teaching and learning, a scheme that leads to raising achievement, closing gaps simultaneously. And what we have come to appreciate is that the issue that basically determines if we can get this kind of achievement-raising, gap-closing outcome is the level of student engagement. Student engagement becomes a bellwether for ultimate gap-closing, achievement-raising outcomes. And engagement itself is something that I think requires at least a little bit more delineation. It's not just about time on task. It's more so about active, positive, progressive, discipline-based involvement in the learning process. And as consistent with the theme of our conference, engagement should get more airtime. The proximal outcome of engagement needs to be more part of our regular conversation when we're talking about raising achievement, closing gaps, and the likes. Two sets of factors that impact engagement, ultimately impacting achievement and gap closing outcomes are what we call, for want of a better term here, student guiding functions, adaptive learning postures, ways to empower students themselves as they become learners, student learning empowerment. And the other category are what we call asset-based strategies. The notion here is to build on or acknowledge or create assets for students and from diverse backgrounds. So what I want to do over the next few minutes, timekeeper, how am I doing? So far? I just started. No, I'm just okay. Keep me honest. All right. I appreciate it. Thanks. So this notion of engagement, again, is complex. It's not just time on task, and it is multidimensional. Behavioral engagement, having to do with persistence toward certain goals. Cognitive engagement, not just bubbling in answers and spitting back what the teacher spits at you, but deep processing, learning how to learn. And motivational engagement, interest, positive value, positive affect attached to the engagement itself. I'm going to sprinkle a few little research examples in just to kind of cement some of the points I'm making. There's this distinction to be made, I believe, between instruction time and engaged time. And this work done a few years ago, I think, speaks to it. This was a study done looking at, again, growth in math from kindergarten to the third grade. Students were broken down into 4 quartiles based upon their math skills, knowledge, and as you may not be surprised to know, the lowest quartile students grew the least from kindergarten to the third grades. And the authors pointed out in this piece that the majority of the students who were in the lowest quartile were disadvantaged students or students from disadvantaged background. The 2 upper quartiles grew the most, but here's where it gets kind of interesting, curious. The lowest quartile students got the most instruction time, the most time designated, set aside for instruction, but they had the lowest levels of engagement. But engagement was the strongest predictor of growth for the lowest performing group. So clearly this at least suggests that engaged time, it's not just how much time you devote to the subject, how much of that time are the students actually engaged. And again, to unpack some of what we've been talking about here a bit more, just to look at these, what I'm calling adaptive learning orientations, guiding functions, student learning empowerment. Three factors have clearly garnered impressive evidence to support their engagement enhancing, achievement enhancing power. Self-efficacy, not self-concept, self-efficacy, self-regulated learning, and incremental ability, belief, mindset. Self-efficacy basically has to do with the belief that one has what's required to accomplish what is desired. It's not about self-concept, it's about self-confidence. Self-confidence. Self-regulated learning is where students come to own their learning process, planning, goal-setting activities, monitoring their work as it progresses along, fixing up when they've gotten off task, then evaluating their own learning. So this ownership is something that they can take and carry once they learned how to self-regulate to other learning settings. And then incremental ability beliefs as opposed to fixed ability beliefs. When students have more fixed ability beliefs, when they come up against challenges in math or reading or whatever, they essentially don't persist. They give up. They say, I don't have the math gene. I'm not a good reader, so why shall I even try? But when you have these incremental, these malleable beliefs, you push on, you persevere, you keep trying until you get better. Just one sort of point to be made about this particular point of incremental belief changes is that somewhat the kind of feedback that we give with very good intentions to students often can work across purposes with developing in our students this incremental belief mindset. You know, when you tell kids things like, hey, you're really smart, you're a math whiz, you are more so reinforcing an ability mindset. But when you have process praise in place that looks at how students can get better, you know, you studied hard for your math test, your improvement showed it, you read the material many times, you tested yourself, that worked. A long, hard assignment, you stuck to it, you got it done. Process praise is the kind of thing that is an important bellwether, if you will, for the promotion of incremental mindsets. I'm going to skip some slides. I'm like a kid in the candy store. I over-prepare for these things, so I want to keep some up within the time period. So, you know, let me just pass through some more examples around those so-called adaptive learning postures. So here are these asset-based strategies that impact engagement, impact achievement. They really sort of fall into three basic categories: intellective factors, interpersonal factors, and what we're calling interconnective factors. Intellective factors implies cognitive functioning, information processing quality. Interpersonal factors essentially look at focusing on ways to maximize the interpersonal, the transpersonal dynamics between teachers and students and among students themselves. The interconnective has to do basically with fostering connections among and between students' lived experiences and the taught curriculum. Under intellective factors, two strategies that have really shown empirical promise are what are called schema-based instruction and direct teaching of critical thinking skills. Schema-based instruction, where you help students to discern regularities and patterns and structures in the material to be learned. Direct teaching is literally, as is suggested, don't penalize kids for not knowing how to do reading comprehension well. Give them reading comprehension strategies. Give them problem-solving strategies. Interpersonal factors, classroom, interpersonal relationship quality, TSRQ, is about having a classroom where teachers are caring, demanding, supportive, but also holding high expectations. Another under the interpersonal is mastery goal structures, which are better to be in place. They have this achievement-raising, gap-closing potency rather than the more customary performance goal structures. Student collaboration, another one. And under interconnective factors, meaningful learning, where you try to situate the learning process for our diverse students more proactively in their lived experiences and culturally relevant pedagogy. So just to drill down a little bit more in this area, information processing quality, schema-based instruction, and direct teaching of critical learning skills. Just a couple of examples. This is little schema template for reading comprehension, narrative text. Somebody wanted but so. Oftentimes text will be a little bit more complex or juicy than this, but this, is a good template to help students pick out certain information for comprehension, for understanding purposes. There's going to be a somebody in the narrative. There's going to be a protagonist, a hero, a shero. There's going to be a goal, something that's wanted, some kind of intention. But there's going to be drama, conflict, drama is going to come up. And eventually there is a resolution. So helping students to see what's the somebody, what's the wanted, what's the but in this particular story, and what's the so can be very helpful in this regard in the service of schema-based instruction. Helping kids to go beyond giving back canned answers and filling in blanks is to get them to deal with more thought-provoking kind of questions, things having to do with comparisons and contrasts. Do you agree, do you disagree? Justify, defend your particular position with evidence. What are the good points? What are the bad points about something? Then, in this area of interpersonal factors, you have this notion of TSRQ, teacher-student relationship quality, caring, supportive, demanding, high expectation, classroom context. What my colleague Jackie Irving years ago referred to as teachers who are warm demanders. And just one little summary research tidbit. When you have in early elementary grades, according to work of Bridget Hammer and John Pianta at UVA, when you have teachers who are sensitive to students' social-emotional needs, when teachers refrain from imposing unilaterally their agenda onto kids, when we have teachers who foster positive affective classroom climate, this has gap closing. This has gap closing consequences. Another piece in this TSRQ area is expectation level, teacher expectations. This is something that people claim is there. It's something that's derived from certain data sets that people then conclude that something's going on here. And some of the work we've done at Howard recently, one of my students' recent dissertations, we directly manipulated teacher expectations with a group of students in inner city, large Midwestern community. We had black kids, 4th graders and 8th graders. The task was to do multiplication word problems. They had a pre-test. Then there were 4 days where they had practice at learning certain strategies to help solve these problems. Then there was a post-test, and again, 4th graders and 8th graders. After the pre-test, the students are randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions, the high teacher expectation and the low teacher expectation. In the low teacher expectation condition, after the pre-test, the students were told, you did okay on the pre-test. We know this is difficult work. Just try your best and try to come out better on the post-test. The high teacher expectation, they were told, based upon how well you did on this pre-test, we know you will excel. If you pay attention and learn these strategies as well, you are going to be a high flyer in essence. So they were the high teacher expectation condition. And these are the results. What you see here is that for the 4th graders, those who were in the high expectation condition improved at 4.68 up to 6.58. It was, I think the total number correct in this study was 12. But look at those in the low expectation condition. They went from 5.31 average score down to 4.88. So those in the high expectation condition, their scores increased from pre-test to post-test. And this was a 1-week study. At the end of the 1 week, the kids who were in the low expectation condition, their scores went down from pre-test to post-test. And the same pattern occurred for 8th graders. This is across 1 week. Oh, by the way, from an ethical standpoint, when the study was over, we told all the kids they did well and that they all can excel. You know, we didn't want to leave any of them lingering in this regard, considering how potent this particular intervention was after 1 week. But suppose kids are getting low expectation conditions for 1 month, for 1 year, for 5 years, for 10 years. They have an ingrained, basically, low expectation prompt inside their heads. This is an issue of concern that we need to pay attention to. Another factor in this interpersonal realm is a focus more so on mastery goal structures as opposed to the more often performance classroom goal structures. Performance goal structures have to do with a focus on who's the best, who gets the gold star in comparison to others. You know, it's who's out on the top end of that normal curve. Whereas the mastery goal structures focuses more on, are you understanding the material? Are you getting to comprehend the material? Are you putting forth the effort? Are you getting better at what you're doing? And mastery goal structures are ones that manifest the data say achievement raising, gap closing outcomes. Collaboration. I want to dwell on this a lot. There's been a lot of airtime given to the importance of cooperative learning, but what's critical is group learning is not the same thing as cooperative learning or learning collaborations, because group learning is just that. You might have folks around the table, but they're kind of working in their own universes. Group collaborative learning is when there are collaborative intellectual exchanges going on among students. And then meaningful learning, you know, teaching for relevance, making personal connections to kids' experiences outside of school, world connections, subject matter connections, building upon prior knowledge and competencies and the likes. Just a little mental exercise to kind of drive this point home. What does this mean? Tell me what this means. No, don't tell me, just to yourself. What do you think this means? The difficulty of your set could be increased if you do a jam followed by a peach. Well, if you know anything about gymnastics, that would have been a piece of cake. You know, having that kind of prior knowledge, you know then what a peach refers to, you know what a jam refers to. Having prior knowledge is very helpful for comprehension. Very helpful. And you know, one thing, they must be gymnasts. Probably right. So I think one takeaway from this little example here is that often we take for granted that when students come to school, they know how to speak quote-unquote academic language inside classrooms. We sometimes just take that for granted when to some degree we may have to make explicit instruction to help students. Oftentimes for English language learners, this is particularly an issue, that they need to get explicit teaching, if you will, tied to academic language. And the bottom line here also is that making links to students' background experiences enhances recall, we know, and also enhances comprehension and knowledge transfer. Then there's the issue of cultural resources. I think the notion here, I could spend 2 hours on this. This is where a lot of my own research has fallen over the last 30 years or so. But when we talk about cultural resources, family, peer, community socialization, fundamental core values, popular culture even, we should appreciate that schooling is not done. It never has been done, if you will, on culturally neutral terrain. Certain cultural themes, certain cultural modalities have been privileged in our schools and don't capture, if you will, the diversity in cultural themes and cultural manifestations that are available for educating our children and our youth. And for time's sake, I'll skip over the examples here. I want to get to it therefore. I can come back to this stuff later on. Or I'll come back next year and do part 2. Whatever. Okay. But what I want to get to here, in my time, to some degree, is to make the point that, we certainly live in this era of high-stakes testing. But in spite of that, we cannot let, what shall I say, the testing tail wag the educational dog. There are multiple outcomes we should be pursuing as we are on this gap closing quest. 4 candidates here: educational optimism, where we want to sort of breed in our students positive expectations for doing well in school. We want to also foster, as another outcome, academic identity, and identity itself is multi-layered. So we want our students to see themselves, for example, as good students. But we also want them to see themselves, for example, as good math or good science students. And we also want to dig deeper and see them as black or brown children who are good in math and good in science. Socio-emotional competence, gaining facility at negotiating effectively interpersonal relationships, emotional modulation inside classrooms. And one that we, I think, overlook to our detriment and to our society's detriment is that we also want them to gain, along with social-emotional competence, what we call transformative competence. Transformative competence, so that what they learn in school, they come to discern how it can be used to the practical benefit of themselves, their family, their communities, and even our larger society. It's not just about, the workshop, that one-shot workshop. It's the follow-up support and the likes that is provided to our professional staff, forming learning communities, getting them to basically reflect on the practices, for them to have time for planning, effective time for planning that's actually spent in planning activities, and to use these same kinds of asset-based strategies, for example, that work for their students should also work for our teachers, to get them to be more critical thinkers, to get them to be able to know that they have assets to be built upon, to get them basically to see themselves as efficacious as teachers, to know how to basically have incremental mindsets about their teaching abilities and things of this nature. So by way of summary here, what I've tried to share with you so far is that engagement is the key. Engagement leads to these achievement-raising, gap-closing outcomes. And there are 4 domains of, shall we say, activities or strategies or interventions that clearly seem to impact positively achievement-raising, gap-closing outcomes by working through engagement. What we call student and learning empowerment issues like self-efficacy, incremental beliefs, self-regulated learning. Intellective factors like critical thinking and promoting the use of schema-based instruction. Interpersonal factors like teacher-student relationship quality, collaboration, using mastery goal structures, and these interconnected factors like meaningful learning and cultural resources. And one of our sort of phrases at Capstone is over-determination of success. And what I would urge people who would pursue this kind of human capacity building approach to is that you start developing activities in classroom that draw on all 4 of these activities, that don't just deal with critical thinking, but somehow or another you got self-efficacy working in there too. You got some collaboration, you got some cultural factors working in. The more you sort of build these things together, have them interdigitate, then the more likely you're going to get the kinds of outcomes that we all want to see for our students. This is a throwaway slide. You can't read it. If you want it later on, that's fine. All it's designed to do is to make the point that a lot of what I've shared with you up to now do converge well with some of the process, sort of factors in Common Core curriculum. This is a cartoon, and I'm paying homage to my friend and colleague Pedro, who helped me to appreciate this. I think one takeaway here is that we have to see teaching and learning as 2 sides of the same academic coin. They're not independent events. They're not independent events. If you're not teaching effectively, and kids kids aren't learning effectively. If you think you're teaching well and kids aren't learning, again, as the cartoon says, you may be having a teachable moment, but they are not having learnable moments. Think of it this way. When you think about your task, for example, as an instructor, I do this with my students even at the higher ed level. I'm not just teaching psychology. You're not just teaching math or teaching reading or teaching biology. You're teaching students psychology. You're teaching students reading. You're teaching students math. And this is something I think needs to get more attention. So why is this approach seem to be one that's having the kind of results that we have been obtaining, others have been obtaining? One, making the commercial again for it being evidence-based, based upon rigorous systematic evidence. And a second is that it focuses on the issue squarely of integrity, not looking at deficits and what kids don't know and can't do, but what they do know, what they can do, what we can glean proactively, because we realize that they may come from so-called poor or disadvantaged backgrounds, but there's complexity, there's coherence and texture, there's depth, not superficiality and overgeneralizations in their lived experiences. And we need to focus as well on this issue of engagement, which you will hear a whole lot more about over the next couple of days. So just, in a way, this is a circular logic slide, but the point of it here, and again by summary from a different angle, students get engaged. Why? Because it makes them feel competent. Peace? Oh, 2 minutes. Okay. So, it makes them feel competent. They own their own learning process. They want to meet their teachers' expectations. They want to please those who care about them. They want to get better. They're involved in personally meaningful activities. They're involved in culturally relevant activities. They're intellectually stimulated. One thing that really jumps out at us is that these whys are also the bases for promoting healthy human development. And so we often have education and human development on 2 tracks, but engagement allows us to have these 2 interpenetrate. When you're optimizing these educational processes, you're also promoting enhanced human development. And here's my future direction. My students and I are looking at what we're calling, we'll get a better word eventually, a phenomenology. It's self-perception of one's place, one's own self-perception of their place in their academic space. And some of these here are just starting to get some attention, and we see this as a new direction that we're taking in our own work, adding to what we've already done. Mattering, feeling that others care about what you say, what you think, and what you do. Sense of belonging, feeling that you're connected to the group, to those in a given academic context. Respect, feeling a sense of being admired and held in high regard by others. Hope, a sense of optimism, and gratitude, having a feeling of thankfulness for receiving something of value, tangible or intangible, that's of educational relevance. So a new direction for our work currently is to hopefully maybe lead to a new circle coming out in our model with regard to this issue of phenomenology. And I just want to just talk a bit about some policy implications of what we're talking about. All too often, transformations, reform activities are strictly top-down. They're strictly top-down. I think one implication from a policy standpoint is that what we need to see more of is top-down support, but for bottom-up transformation, particularly starting in the classroom. That needs to be the focus. And focus more so on the fact that transactional solutions have merit, immediate context matters, investing in human capacity building, and not just for students, but for all educational stakeholders, teachers as adult learners. The professional development for them is teacher capacity building. We need to develop the capacity better of school leaders. We talk about 3-dimensional leadership. We know that schools must be run well. We know that students must be taught well. And we know folks got to get along well inside these buildings, between the building and what's happening outside. And that requires 3-dimensional leadership: administrative leadership, instructional leadership, and human relations leadership. It can be distributed, but all 3 of these domains have to be manifest in a school setting. And finally, pictures worth 1,000 words. They stopped doing Calvin and Hobbes years ago, but it was one of my favorite cartoons, and I saved this one for posterity's sake. Here is Calvin reflecting on his school day after talking with his buddy Hobbes. And what is he telling Hobbes? He said he felt in school like he was part of a cattle herd, being prodded to go this way or that way. He felt like he was basically having learning poured inside his head, like he was on his assembly line. He felt like a hamster on a running wheel, a lot of activity, but not a lot of progress. Felt like he was part of a chain gang. Felt like he was a wind-up robot. Felt like a parrot who was just spitting back what was spitting him. Felt like a brain-dead zombie. Felt like a round peg being hammered into a square hole. Felt like a fish out of water. And all I can say in closing is that much of what I talked about today is being done of the places, of the sites, I'm sure in the state of New York. The issue is not that it's not being done, it just needs to be done in a more widespread fashion. And when it is, if some of these directions and suggestions I've offered today are more widely implemented, then maybe Calvin and other students' days in school will be much, much more worthwhile. Thank you for your time. Whatever.
How does a teacher who may not have the typical culturally relevant pedagogy amend that, similar to what Freire talks about, with really kind of taking a look at where we are? How does one do that so that we can develop a more engaging classroom, particularly if the teacher is of the dominant society?
Right. So that's a tough question. It is. You planted that question, didn't you? No. Okay. But so this is, I'm going to say it sort of in a phrase because I just don't have time to elaborate. What we have learned over the years is that you cannot really think teachers into acting differently, but you sure can act teachers into thinking differently. And so the point there is to have them try out some of these strategies. First you talk to them, what's happening in the classroom? They're not doing this. This is happening. They don't know this. They're bothering what? Have them, to give you that, like the baseline. Now let's try out some of these things we've talked about. Not just, like it's a microwave in 1 hour, you're going to see something different. Let's try it for a week, and let's come back and talk. And then, do you now see more engagement going on? Well, what do we attribute that to? What have you done differently? Have you honored their cultural integrity? Have you heard their voices? Are you prepared to give them feedback that enables them really to want to keep on going and not give up because you told them that they were, in so many words, dumb? So in a phrase, we have found that acting them into thinking differently is something that has some currency.